We set our work aside. We leave our cares behind on this day of Sabbath rest. On this your holy day, we come to give you praise on this day of Sabbath rest.
Is in Minnesota. There's not that many places to climb in Minnesota. It's not known as a mountainous state. It's known as a lake state. But there are a few rocks to climb in Pipestone and over on the edge between Wisconsin and Minnesota, and we'd go climb at Taylor's Rock a bit. But one place that is a little more spectacular to climb is up on the north shore of Lake Superior. There are some fairly substantial basalt cliffs up there that are interesting to climb, and the trip I'm going to tell you about this morning was up on there. But first of all, I want us to read, let's get into the Word. Let's read Psalm 62. So why don't we do this? I like to get everybody involved, and so that you're not just sitting there, I will give you a task. So there's not quite enough verses to go around. I thought there would be, but we attracted a couple of more people at the last minute here. And so let's just start at the front here, read a verse each, and just go around the circle here as we are reading Psalm 62, which is currently my favorite psalm. That changes all the time. You know, you love one for a while, and then you're reading through and you find another one, and then you love that one. And you can love them all, but you have one favorite at a time. So currently, Psalm 62 is my favorite. I won't guarantee it'll continue that way. But go ahead, sir. Start with verse 1. Read it out nice and loud so everybody can hear it.
Truly my soul waiteth upon God. From him cometh my salvation.
No problem.
He only is my rock and my salvation. He is my defense. I shall not be greatly moved.
How long will you attack a man? You shall be slain, all of you. Thank you. Like a leaning wall and a tottering fence.
They only consult to cast him down from his high position. They delight in lies. They bless with their mouth, but they curse inwardly.
My soul will wait silently for God alone, for my expectation is from him. He only is my rock and my salvation. He is my defense. I shall not be moved. And God is my salvation and my glory, the rock of my strength, and my refuge is in God.
Trust in him, my people. Pour out your hearts to him, because he alone is our refuge.
Strong men who claim to support us are bluffing. Refined men who claim to support us are lying. Weigh them on a scale against God, and they're nothing in a time of crisis. They're lighter than a breath of air.
Do not trust in oppression, nor vainly hope in robbery. If riches increase, do not set your heart on them.
God hath spoken once, twice have I heard this, that power belongeth unto God.
And you, O Lord, demonstrate loyal love, for you repay men for what they do.
Okay. Now that was quite a variety of translations, of course. So it demonstrates how broadly the semantic field of these words are in Hebrew. There are several words in here that are actually rare words that could be translated a number of ways. But you get the gist of what's happening here. David, as you know, is often attacked. The psalm right after this is a psalm in 63, a psalm where David is in the desert of Judea, and of course he's there hiding. He's hiding because the king is trying to kill him. And this one may be from later in his life, Psalm 62, may be from later in his life after he is king, and he still has enemies trying to take him out. And his enemies are trying to use all kinds of things against him. And who is he choosing to depend on? And how does he describe God several times in this psalm? As his rock. As his rock. Now, rocks are pretty solid things. And when you put a term like solid rock on it, it causes you to view rocks differently than if you just say the term rock. Like, I'm going to go get a truckload of rock to put on my driveway. That brings one vision to your mind. Or, I'm going to kick this rock down the road as I walk home from school. That brings another vision into mind. But look at that solid rock. Brings a completely different vision into mind. Now, David expresses himself about himself in terms of rock, and he expresses himself about God. He expresses God concerning rock. And they're very different terminologies. Notice there in verse 3, he describes himself. Now, just before we read this, remember, David's a king. How do kings or high politicians usually describe themselves? Glowing terms, okay? Usually emphasizing strength, security. You can trust me to have everything in my hands and everything under control because I'm the one in charge. Therefore, for stability's sake and for ego's sake, kings and executives tend to describe themselves in very strong and glowing terms. We'll contrast that in a minute. Here's how David describes himself in verse 3. Would you all throw me down, this leaning wall, this tottering fence? Now, leaning wall. This is a rock wall, by the way. Okay? Can you picture a rock wall that's leaning? Okay? Built up of loose rocks and tottering. You know, tottering brings up a certain visual image. Tottering rocks are not what you would use as a foundation to build things on. Tottering rocks are not what you even want to lean on. If you lean on it, you may lean it on over, and the whole thing would not only totter, it would fall, collapse in a heap. This is not an image of strength and solidity. This is an image of weakness and vulnerability and knowing that he cannot handle whatever it is that's going to be coming, including his enemies who are currently attacking him. And they're going to push him over, and they're going to gloat over him afterwards. So there's a picture that David gives of himself. Let's contrast that for a minute with a king you're very familiar with, in a story you're very familiar with, Nebuchadnezzar, in Daniel chapter 3. Now, Nebuchadnezzar has just gotten this vision, this dream, in chapter 2. And Daniel has interpreted it for him. And this dream was of a great statue with a head of gold, chest and arms of silver, and the belly and of brass, et cetera, all the way down. Thank you. And when you get to the bottom, you've got this whole foundation is based on miry clay and iron mixed together, which of course don't mix. So it's not, the statue is not an image of stability either. And of course, it is representing a sequence of kingdoms. Now, kings don't like to hear sequence of kingdoms unless they're the final apex, okay? They don't mind having all the kingdoms I destroyed in building my empire. That's okay. Sequence of kingdoms okay in that situation. But what they don't want to hear is somebody's coming after them. So of course in chapter 3, when he builds the image, instead of having a head of gold and chest of arms of silver, the whole thing is gold from top to bottom. And of course, in usual kingly fashion, he wants everybody to worship what he has set up. And of course, if they don't, he's already prepared something for them. There's this fiery furnace. Now, why would he prepare a fiery furnace before anybody had even decided not to worship? Just to show that he could. Okay? I want to have a very stark relationship with my people, Nebuchadnezzar says. I want them to worship what I have set up, or else I kill them, because I can. And of course, then we got the 3 Hebrew children who do not. Children as in, they've finished college, they've finished their master's degree, they're working for the king, they're provincial rulers. Who knows exactly how old they are at this point, but they refuse to bow down. And what does Nebuchadnezzar say? Look it up in Daniel chapter 3. What does Nebuchadnezzar say at first? Nebuchadnezzar is telling this. He's furious with rage in verse 13. He summons them up there and he brought them before the king. In verse 14, he asks, is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold that I've set up? Now, when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music, that's quite the phrase there. That whole phrase gets repeated numerous times just to show you how important this music is. This is the music that is the sign that you worship. So it's very important that you get a listing of every single instrument in there. It makes the king sound very impressive. He doesn't have just a single flute or a single trumpet. He's got a whole band there, and he says to fall down and worship the I have made, very good. But if you do not worship it, and here comes the kingliness, if you do not worship it, you will be immediately thrown into a blazing furnace. Then, and here's the zinger, what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? Kings tend to put themselves above gods. What God can rescue you from my hand? Now, he found out the answer to that in just a few minutes. And he's shocked and he's awed, and he has to admit there is a God who can rescue them from his hand. There is a God that has the power to snatch them right away from them and protect them. The God did not keep him from throwing them into the fire, because that would have seemed too easy. But God kept them from getting hurt by the king's fire. And the king had to be in awe of such a God. But in kingly fashion, notice what he said about that. Okay, he says, Nebuchadnezzar in verse 26 approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them. And they saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was the hair on their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. I can't even do that when I roast a hot dog around a campfire. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command. Now he's admitting all this. But notice his decree in verse 29. He's admitted all these things. This God's greater than I am. I will praise this God along with everybody else, but I'm still king, and I will tell you, everybody must praise this God, or I will tear your house apart and make your clan a dung heap. He had to assert that I'm still in control thing. And there it was. That's how kings usually act. There's another one. Let's take a look at 2 Kings. 2 Kings chapter 18. The story is that Sennacherib is conquering all the cities around Judea. He's the biggest, meanest, baddest dude on the earth, and he knows it. He's got the baddest army, and he's coming down, and he's making sure that everybody is giving him honor and giving him praise, and even more importantly, giving him a large chunk of gold and silver every year. That tribute. You know, we call it taxes today. They called it tribute then. It's got some similarities, some overlap. But he's coming to Jerusalem. Now, before he came to Jerusalem, he wiped out a whole bunch of towns in Judea to get the attention of those in Jerusalem. He did not want to walk up and start with Jerusalem, because if he started with Jerusalem, he may not have their attention yet. They may not know what he could do. So he devastates a bunch of other towns before he gets there. So they have already gotten the report of what happened. Now, he doesn't actually want to destroy Jerusalem, because if you destroy the goose that lays the golden egg, how do you get the gold? If you come up and you destroy the biggest economic opportunity in the whole region, how are you going to get your tribute every year? But of course, he has to let them know that he can destroy them if he chooses. And then he wants to sit back and make promises. And so he's making promises. He says, look in verse 28 of chapter 18, the commander stood and called out in Hebrew, "Hear the word of the great king, the king of Assyria. This is what the king says. Do not let Hezekiah deceive you. He cannot deliver you from my hand. Do not let Hezekiah persuade you to trust in the Lord when he says, the Lord will surely deliver us. This city will not be given into the hand of the king of Assyria." He's done his intel. He knows this is what's being said inside the city walls. He's been sending spies around to listen. He knows what they're talking about. He knows that first Hezekiah was afraid, and then Hezekiah got a promise from God. And now Hezekiah is telling people, don't worry about that king and his 120,000 men out there. Don't worry about them. God's got our back. God's trustworthy, and he's promised us he's going to deliver us. But of course, that intel has gotten to the commander, and he's making it clear that no other nation has ever been able to withstand Sennacherib. And there's no way that this nation or this nation's God will be able to withstand him. So he said, the Lord will surely deliver us in this city and will not be given into the hand of the Syrian. Do not listen to Hezekiah. This is what the king of Assyria says. Make peace with me and come out to me, and then every one of you will eat from his own vine and fig tree and drink water from his own cistern until I come and take you to a land like your own, a land of grain and new wine, and a land of bread and vineyards, a land of olive trees and honey. Choose life, not death. Boy, he makes a prison sentence and being dispossessed from their land sound really inviting. You know, I will make sure that you have your own vine and your own fig tree in your own cistern. Now, most of the people didn't even have that to begin with. They were too poor. But now he's promising them, I will bring you up into the middle class, the upper middle class. You'll have your own cistern. Economic arrival is just in your hands. All you have to do is let me move you to another land. Well, this becomes a very complex picture. What, of course, he's going to do is he's going to march them at the end of a sword point and force them to go someplace else and give their land to another people. Because Sennacherib had this displacement theory of control. If you worship your God here on this mountain, I will move you to another mountain where there's a foreign god, and then you will have this relationship with this other god, which will be no longer this long father-son, mother-daughter, mother-daughter relationship with a God. You'll be confused. You'll have a new God, and you will recognize that I, Sennacherib, your new God, are more powerful than your other gods. And then he'll take that people and move them where you had just been. So nobody's in their own turf. Everybody's displaced. But you get their vine, they get your vine, and cisterns are built, and the whole thing's going to work out. You know, this is the dream that he has. This is the economic upswing he's talking about. And of course, the bottom of it is, if you follow me, you'll get life. If you follow your God, I'll kill you. And I can. Now, that's the promise part. The other part comes a little later. Do not listen to Hezekiah, the last part of verse 32. For he is misleading you when he says the Lord will deliver us. Has the God of any nation ever delivered his land from the hand of the king of Assyria? Where are the gods of Hamath and Arpad? Where are the gods of the Sepharvaim, the Hena and Eva? Have they rescued Samaria from my hand? By the way, it's called Samaria now. It had been called Israel in previous generations. Who of all the gods of these countries has been able to save his land from me? How then can the Lord deliver Jerusalem from my hand? That's how kings talk. That's how kings talk. You know how this ends too. They suddenly find themselves all dead. And it's the victory that God had predicted through Hezekiah did not come by Hezekiah and a little band of men rushing out there bravely with their swords and attacking this great horde. It didn't happen that way. God did it. Because Hezekiah, like David, is, one of these leaning walls. But God is a solid rock. Our God has strength. Our God has power. Our God is a solid rock. Okay, back to the north rocks on Lake Superior. My friend Paul and I had been climbing together for 3 years by that point, and we had learned to trust one another, quite frankly. And there was one rock there that I had been wanting we'd been up there 3 years in a row. I had been wanting to climb it, but I was never the top rock climber. I was always okay, pretty good, but never wonderful at it. And I was better at face climbing than crack climbing. And this was a crack route. It's called Bluebells. Beautiful, beautiful rock, black basalt, very large, very beautiful. And it's a nice crack and then a ret, so you can kind of it's a little finger crack. You can get your finger up to it about to the first knuckle. And then you can put your feet on the sides and there's no holds. You just kind of put friction on there. Now, one of the difficulties is that on the north shore of Lake Superior, they have a local custom. Because the rock is black basalt, and they don't want to make it look different than what it was, they had a ban on hand chalk. Now, hand chalk is for those who want to have a good grip instead of a slimy grip when they're trying to hold on to a rock. And it's particularly important for those who have sweaty hands. I have been blessed with sweaty hands. So climbing on the North Shore is always more difficult for me, simply because when you take, I don't know, granite, if you got wet hands, still has good friction. But basalt gets really slick when it gets moist. And if you're providing your moisture everywhere you put your hand, it can be very slick. So it's going to be more difficult for me without chalk. I'm used to chalking up my hands and then I can grip. So I start up, and, oh, by the way, and I got to give you the location of it too. It's a wonderful route. It starts, it ends at the very top. It's about a 300-foot cliff, okay? And it ends at the very top, but it starts not at the bottom. It doesn't start at the bottom. It starts about 2/3 the way up, or about a little between half and 2/3 the way up. So it's about a 125-foot route, but you start it hanging on the side of a cliff or standing on a little ledge. And that ledge where you stand to start the route, it's a good, nice solid ledge. You can actually put both feet on it and stand on it. So we rappelled down to that ledge, Paul and I, and then we pulled our rope down, and now I'm going to lead climb it back up. Now, when you're lead climbing, you have to understand that you're always ahead of your last protection. So, and it's always doubled plus. Because every time you get ahead of your last protection piece, you're not only going to fall down to it, but fall down to the slack of the rope and then the stretch of the rope. Because the rope is flexible so that it won't jerk you when you stop. It lets you down easy. So we had a 6% stretch rope. So you climb up maybe 10 feet above your last protection point, and you have a 22-foot fall. Which is fine if you're just falling into air. Falling doesn't hurt. It's hitting that hurts. Okay? So when a fall and a length of fall, it can be kind of violent, stopping quickly, but it's the hitting something that is dangerous. So bluebells, when you first start it, you first 20 feet of the climb or so go up the side, and then there's this big shelf. This big shelf is about 5 foot across. I mean, you could put a bed on there and sleep on it, no problem. But then from there, you go up, and then you start the actual crack. And the crack is unending and just continuous for the next 90 feet or so. It's a beautiful climb. And I had never climbed it before, but I had eyeballed it. And so I was looking at it, I said, okay, I'm looking forward to this climb. Paul, we will set you up on an anchor down on this ledge, this little ledge. And then I'll go climb up. And when I get to the spot where I'm placing my first protection point actually into the crack itself, that will be 2 things. 1, it's the crux of the climb. It's the hardest place. But 2, it's the most important place to get your protection in. Because after I leave this shelf and go onto the crack, if I don't get my first protection point in on the crack itself, then I will fall back onto the shelf. And shelves are wonderful when you're standing and looking up, but they're terrible when you're falling down. So I needed to protect the crux. So I took a number 5 rock. Any of you ever climbed? Okay, you know what a 5 rock is? It's about the size of my thumbnail, but it's thicker than my thumbnail. It's not quite as thick as my thumb, but it's about that big. It's a nut with a wire coming out on it, and I put that. I got about 3 feet off of the shelf, and I put that in a spot between 2 rocks where it had a good hold. It was good for a down pull, but not for an out pull. Because if it would be an out pull, then it would flip from behind the rocks. But if it's straight down pull, it will hold security because it's cammed in there. So that's the piece, the only piece I had placed since the shelf. And it was about 10 feet off the shelf, maybe 12. And then the crux of the climb was maybe 18 or 20 feet off the shelf. So it's very questionable whether that number 5 rock would stop me before I hit the shelf. So before I went to the crux of the climb, I eyeballed it and I said, there's a spot where a number 8 rock will fit. And in preparation, I said, I know when I get up there, I'm going to be, my hands are going to be sweaty, I'm going to be slimed, I'm going to be working on things. So I took my number 8 rock out, put a quick draw on it, and stuck it in my teeth. So when I got there, I would be able to just slip it in and clip in, and then I'm secure for the rest of the climb. No problem at that point. If once I get that piece in the rock and I clip the rope to it, I'm golden. So I start up. I said, okay, Paul, climbing on. And he's now about 30 feet below me, out of sight, because he's around an overhang, and he can't see me, but he can hear me still. And he's standing with a beautiful view of Lake Superior. He's about 150, 175 feet off the rocks at the edge of the lake, and it's all just cut back. There's nothing between him and the bottom of the rocks at the lake. So he's got, if he were to, say, jump off that ledge without a rope on, he would have a beautiful flight of about 175 feet and then be smashed to pieces on the rocks at the bottom. Like I said, it's not the falling that hurts, it's the hitting. So, but he is attached to a rope, and that rope is attached to two anchor points right beside him. And he's belaying me as I am lead climbing as I go on up. And so I get in position, I go up on the crack, it's just a little finger crack, I'm able to make about 3 moves, and then I get to the spot where I'm just pulling this out in the number 8 rock and going to slip it into the crack there, the only spot wide enough to get a number 8 rock in. And lo and behold, I found that somebody else had put a number 8 rock in that spot several years ago, and the wires had weathered off. So the rock that was in there was just a rock that was blocking me from getting mine in, but there was no wire to connect my rope to, and I suddenly realized I can't place this protection point. Now I'm about 22 feet off the deck, and my last protection point is 10 feet below me. So I do the math and I realize my protection point is going to be virtually useless. I will hit the rock before the protection will stop me. And I'm telling this in a long time, but of course you don't have a long time. I'm barely, I got 2 fingers like this, and I'm trying to manipulate things with the other hand, and my feet are smeared on the side of the rock. It's not a nice, tight angle like this. It's more like this. So I'm just kind of barely got an out push here, and I realize I'm not going to make it. I'm not going to be able to get this number 8 rock back onto my belt, find another piece that might hold there and get it up there. I hadn't even, and my mind is starting to panic a little bit. And I realized that I'm not even able to concentrate well enough to figure out what I should get off my belt, let alone find it and get it in place and then get the rope clipped to it. So I holler back to Paul. I said, Paul, I might fall here, and if I do, you need to jump off the cliff. Now, what would be holding him if he were to jump off the cliff would be the 2 pieces we had put right where he's at, which are secure. But the rope continues all the way up to that number 5 rock, and then another 10 feet up to me. So if I were to fall and hit that deck and he had jumped off the cliff, he would go sailing out and come smash into the cliff if the 2 held. If the rock, number 5 rock, didn't hold, then we'd all go a lot farther. So as I said that, my foot started to slip, and my 2 finger hold is tightening up, but I'm really sweating at this point. And there's no chalk on my hands. So I realize that my fingers are going to slip out. Now again, I had told Paul, if I fall, jump. And about 1 second later, I fell and hollered, falling! Now, I had a decision to make. Once again, decisions have to be made very quickly in a falling situation. It doesn't take very long to fall 22 feet. It doesn't take long at all. You have to react immediately, or else your decision has been made for you. But I realized, as I was telling him he needed the jump, I realized that if I were to hold my position and fall feet first, even if he jumped off, I would probably hit that deck with enough force to break both ankles. But if I were to push myself back and lay out flat, and he were to jump off, it is possible that I would fall and just before I hit would get caught in a flat layout position and have no damage at all. Of course, there's the possibility that the number 5 rock would pop, in which case the broken ankles would be far better scenario. Or there's also the possibility that Paul would not jump, in which case the broken ankles would be the much better scenario. So the question was, do I trust the rock, the number 5 rock, and do I trust Paul to jump? Now, this has taken me a long time to describe, but in reality, the decision was immediate and the response was immediate. And my immediate response in that circumstance was to trust the rock and to trust Paul, and so I lay out. And Paul jumped, and the rock held. And I stopped about 18 inches off the shelf. Can you trust God? Can you trust God to jump off a cliff for you? Can you trust God to be the solid one for you? Let's reread this Psalms now. The end of Psalm 62 has a very interesting, one of those devices where one thing I have heard, 2 things have been said. You know, there's a bunch of these in the Proverbs. 3 things I know, 4 things I have heard, and then it lists 4 things. The first 3 are setting up, and then the last one's the zinger. You know, both of these are the zinger here. 1 thing God has spoken, 2 things I have heard. Actually, I reread this in Hebrew this morning to make sure that I was getting the nuance right. And it's really more like 1 thing God has spoken, 2 things have been announced. It's in the passive. And 2 things have been declared, another part of the semantic field, that word, but it's you know that it has been said, but it all depends on who said it as to whether you're going to relate positively to it or not. You see, when you hear something, you need to evaluate the source as to whether or not you're going to trust it. If you hear something and you cannot independently verify it, you need to consider the source. So God has said 1 thing, 2 things have been announced. In the context, it is suggesting that God has said 1 thing and He has announced another thing. So it has been announced by God. And what have been said? 2 things. The first one is that you, O God, are strong. Now, we've got a couple of other statements about strength in here. Look up in verse 2. He alone is my rock. He is my fortress. How about verse 6? He alone is my rock and my salvation. As opposed to what I am, this teetering fence made of rock that's a butterfly lands on it wrong and it all goes down. He is my rock. This is the strength part. This is the strength of God being expressed by David. You, O God, are strong. Now, is strength enough to make you trust somebody? Sennacherib was strong. He was even making promises. And he was strong enough to back his promises up. But should he be trusted? Being strong is not enough. If our God is strong and only strong, then we should be a little worried. Or, alternatively, if we picture God as strong, but only strong, then maybe we don't quite trust him. Because strength is not enough. There are bad people that are strong. I mean, Nebuchadnezzar was strong before his conversion and after his conversion, but I wouldn't trust him before his conversion. Sennacherib was strong. All kinds of Shalmaneser was strong. So God is strong. That's only good news if he's on your side. It's only good news that God is strong if he's using that strength for your benefit. So to trust God, we need to know he can do what he says. But that's not enough. We have to know that he wants to. We have to know that he will. We have to know that he's got our best interest at heart. So the second thing, you, O God, are strong, and that you, O Lord, are chesed. That's a Hebrew term that can be translated in various ways. In my Bible, it's got loving. What are some of the other translations you've got of that word? Merciful. Devoted. Trustworthy is another way this is translated oftentimes. Chesed is throughout the Old Testament. This word is used to describe God. It has to do with God being just to those who need justice, merciful to those who need mercy, loving to those who need love, kind to those who need kindness, trustworthy for those who need trustworthiness. All these things are the semantic range of this term chesed. So, one, God is strong. He's the rock. He's the fortress. And he's got tender, loving mercy for you. The steel and the velvet. He's strong and he's got tender, loving mercy for you. Which means he will jump off that cliff for you. And in fact, he did. John 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And he made everything. Okay? God is powerful. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And then, of course, as the story goes on in John, this Logos, this Word, this God who has come down to us, jumps off the cliff for us. He goes to the cross and he dies to cover our sin, to show us his love, to do for us what we cannot do for ourselves. He jumps off that cliff for us. And so when you're in that dicey spot, when you're in that place where you know you've taken on a little too much and you're in a good chance you're going to fall, who do you turn to? God is strong enough to turn to. But do you know he's trustworthy and has loving, kind, tender mercy for you? To know that takes experience and relationship and built up trust over time. In the situation with Paul and the fall off Bluebells, Paul needed to jump off the cliff if I were going to live. I knew he would. Why did I know he would? because we had been climbing together for 3 years, and every time a situation had come up where he needed to commit, he did. He held up his end of the rope every time. A couple of years later, I was climbing El Capitan. We climbed the nose on El Capitan and Yosemite together a couple of years later, but then we're trying a second route. And I'm in a tight spot where I can't see him, and it's too much wind, he can't hear me. And I'd been trying for 45 minutes to get past a tight spot because I didn't have any aliens. Aliens you can put in pin scars. That's rock shop talk. But it's a certain kind of camming device that works well in old pin scars that have been hollowed out by years of erosion. And I didn't have the right piece to go in there, and that's what I needed. And so I was feeling vulnerable, and so I tried to put a talon on a flake, which is just a quarter-sized piece of rock that was coming out about the size of a quarter, about the width of a quarter. It won't hold much, but I put a talon on it, and I put my weight on it, and I was about 8 to 12 inches from reaching where I could make the next clip to a bolt, solid bolt at the next belay station. And the chip popped. And I went down 36 feet. After 45 minutes of silence, Paul suddenly had one of the biggest falls he's ever caught. He's dangling down there underneath the overhang and doing nothing, no movement, nothing for 45 minutes. Nothing he heard from me, nothing. And all of a sudden, bam! A 36-foot fall, which just shook his world. But he had the rope in the brake position that whole 45 minutes. I knew he would. That's what I needed. So I knew he would. You have to have that kind of trust in the God who is the rock of your salvation. That kind of trust only comes with experience and relationship. Because otherwise, instead of trusting him to jump off the cliff, you're going to say, well, I'd rather break my ankles than hurt myself. And you'd end up with all kinds of shattering wounds that if you just trust God, you wouldn't have. But you can't trust God unless you learn to trust God. And you learn to trust God by allowing yourself to depend on him. Read his promises. And then step out in faith and live his promises. If he asks you to go places where there's risk, whatever that risk might be, you can go with confidence. Because our God is ready and willing to jump off a cliff for us. Thank you.